Hello, my name's Rebecca Pearse. I'm a lecturer in the School of Sociology here and the other half of my time in the Fenner School of Environment and Society. It's my great pleasure to open today's energy update hosted by the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. To begin, it's important that we acknowledge country, that we're meeting here today on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. They are the traditional custodians of this land. And I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and extend my respect to any other First Nations people who may be here with us today. For those joining online, feel free to write to us in the chat. My colleagues are there waiting to hear from you. And you might want to also note the traditional lands from which you're zooming in from. It'll be great to hear from you. So what's happening in this first part of the afternoon? The first 50 minutes we'll hear from Professor Frank Jotzo, Head of Energy at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions and faculty member at the Crawford School of Public Policy. So I'm going to hand over to Frank shortly. After we've heard from him, I'll provide a few comments myself as a sociologist working in this field, interested in policy and the social issues. But very quickly, we'll open up for questions and discussion in the room and online. So if any questions come up for you, you can zoom in. I've got a tablet, or I will, and I'll be able to read the online questions and we can take some questions from the audience. Just a heads up, at 10 to 3, we'll close this first segment and then have a nice 40-minute afternoon tea together. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Frank. Thank you.
Very warm welcome, everyone in the room and online. And so this is an event of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, one of our update series. And really the purpose is firstly to provide an update of where we're at, in this case on energy developments through the year, to showcase some tiny little sliver of ANU research in conjunction with speakers from industry, from government, from civil society. And then, of course, I think most importantly of all, to foster a conversation among really the broader community on energy. And so there's a really good crowd here in the room. I'm saying that for those listening online. And if you are online, please do engage on the chat in the Q&A and we'll pick up your questions and comments. So I've got a really broad talk prepared because it's the update. It's the annual energy update, and I'm very happy that I think you will indulge me on that really broad. So where we stand in terms of the global energy transition is, of course, the question of global emissions reductions. Yeah? And where we're at there is way behind the 8 ball of where we need to be in terms of heading for an outcome well below 2 degrees as per Paris Agreement, or in fact a 1.5 degree outcome as science tells us we should be aiming for in order to avoid the worst of climate change impacts. So this is the IPCC assessment of where things are heading on the basis of currently implemented policies, essentially flatlining of global greenhouse gas emissions right to the middle of the century, when really what needs to happen for below 2 degrees or 1.5 is dramatic reductions down all the way to net zero. Okay, so that's the situation. However, the actual picture of what's likely to emerge looks substantially better than the currently implemented policies, and I'll come to that in a minute. One thing that's important right now on the agenda is the so-called global stocktake. So this is an instrument of the Paris Agreement implementation. It's an exercise that will be conducted every 5 years, and the first global stocktake is a big feature of the discussion this year at the UN Climate Change Conference, the COP28 conference, which in fact starts on the weekend. That Global Stocktake Synthesis Report, it's available online, states a number of things, among them the predictable ones, namely there is climate action happening, there is action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it is nowhere near enough. Really same finding as the ARC, the IPCC assessment report that was released this year in the synthesis findings. Now, one thing to emphasize about the global stocktake is that the stocktake calls for what it labels systems transformation. So it's no longer just a question of reducing emissions here and there and getting ready for climate change impacts, but systemic change in many parts of our economies and societies is needed in order to properly deal with the problems. But it's also an opportunity to actually change the model of development to one where low greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation to climate change impacts, and development and societal objectives are ultimately in harmony, right? Systems transformations. Global Stocktake Synthesis Report also calls for a focus on inclusion and equity, right? Including as a means to actually enable the kind of ambition that will be needed in global emissions reductions and energy transition in particular. Okay, so inclusion and equity as an enabler of ambition, and I'll come back to some of these sort of political economy questions in due course. Now, things are looking better than you might think on the basis of assessment of current policies. These are annual greenhouse gas emissions growth rates from 2015 to 2016 for the world, OECD and non-OECD countries, right? And so what you could see is a number of years with fairly substantial greenhouse gas emissions growth worldwide, driven in particular by the non-OECD countries. Then you have the COVID dip, then you have the COVID rebound, right? And then you've got 2022, where growth rates in global emissions were only about 1% and relatively homogeneously split between OECD and non-OECD countries. An update on estimated 2023 greenhouse gas emissions growth rates and composition and so forth is due next week from the Global Carbon Project. So that's certainly one to look out for. So the good news here is that we've seen really substantially reduced greenhouse gas emissions growth rates in developing countries. Now, the outlook, in fact, on current trends, near-term trends, as assessed by the International Energy Agency, is that global greenhouse gas emissions may well peak this decade. Okay, if that happens, that is precisely what needs to happen to stay below 2 degrees. We need peak global greenhouse gas emissions soon, and the IEA assesses that it is, in fact, on that track. That's really tremendously good news, actually. That's not, that's this far cry from achieving that steep reduction that we will need to see in the 2020s, 2030s, and 2040s. But if we can turn the corner globally to annual reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, that will be a big achievement. And the assessment of that, based on currently implemented policies, improves year on year. Okay, so if you line up the IEA current policy projections in the projection year 2021, 22, 23, each time there's a pronounced step downwards in the reassessment of where we're likely to be over coming decades on the basis of announced policies, right? The reason for that is twofold. Firstly, stronger policies, and secondly, substantial improvements continued improvements in zero carbon energy technology. That's really the fundamental thing that sits behind it. And when you look at the difference between a baseline assessment of what might have happened without the Paris Agreement, or in some sort of world where there's not much change, not much progress on climate policy and not much technological progress, right? Emissions would have kept going up. The assessment now is that under current policies, like I said, the STEPS scenarios is IEA current policy will peak and start declining, right? And the difference is about 2/3 of the difference is due to wind and solar power. The rest to demand side electrification and various other factors, right? So that's really what's getting us to turn the corner here. Overall, there's a massive amount of emissions reductions the world over that can be had at really affordable economic cost. And what we're showing here is the IPCC assessment in the 6th assessment cycle of technical opportunities to cut emissions in all sectors of the global economy. Okay, so this is a bottom-up tallying up of opportunities to cut emissions, right? Think of it as going through the entire catalog of where currently we have greenhouse gas emissions in the world economy, right? Shaking the tree really thoroughly, right? And assuming that we implement everything in an optimal cost minimizing fashion everywhere in the world, right? So this is, of course, an impossible ambition that will not be met. But if we did meet it, if we were to meet that one, right, then we would, on this estimation, see reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions by 50% at 2030 at costs below $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent avoided. Now, 100 US, what's that? 150, 160 Australian a ton. That sounds like an awfully large number in Australia, where, you know, the carbon pricing mechanism that was abolished in 2014 was then at $24 a ton, right? The credit price at the moment, safeguard mechanism and ACCUs is maybe in the low 30s or thereabouts, not 150. However, the EU emissions trading price is, of course, around about the 80, 90 euro mark, right? That's just about there at that kind of price level, right? So in that sense, that is an eminently affordable cost level. Halving of global emissions by 2030, if you could harvest every opportunity to do so. If you're only going to something like $20, 20 US a ton, which is really quite a low cost, right? Which is well within the reach of what you can reasonably do in developing countries at this point in time. The estimate is that you'd approximately shave a quarter of current emissions by 2030, right? Where's all of that potential? Well, right throughout the economy, obviously, but it's heavily concentrated in energy, in particular in substitution to renewable energy, as well as in the land sector, right? So increased carbon sequestration on the land, as well as various opportunities in agriculture to reduce emissions related to food production, okay? About 2/3 of the global estimated potential are in those two sectors. That's mirrored largely in individual jurisdictions, but of course not completely, depending on emissions structures. Now, further on technologies is, of course, nothing new. We've seen absolutely tremendous reductions in clean energy costs. Okay, this is what sits behind it. We've seen reductions in solar costs, in wind costs, in battery costs of a factor of 10 or more over the space of a little more than a decade, right? This is really as good as you might ever imagine it could get in terms of cost reductions. And this is, of course, what enables the global energy transition. And those cost reductions are continuing. Right-hand panel here, I've got some fairly fresh data and projections from Bloomberg. They're seeing a continued reduction in battery costs by another, what is it, I think 14% or so just this year. We're seeing the typical module price for solar panels now at 16 US cents per watt, okay? So if you had told someone that back in the year 2010, they would have thought you're trying to make a bad joke or something like that, right? Can never be that cheap, right? This is approaching the cost of just the building materials, right? It's fantastic, right? And of course, consequently, we're seeing enormously large install rates. And so the estimated install rates for solar power this year will be 400 gigawatts in the world, which is a very large number and 50% more than last year, okay? Now, are we going to run out of stuff? Are we going to run out of the raw materials that we need for that energy transition? Answer, no. Most definitely we are not. Why not? Because we're seeing the pattern of increased resource development repeated everywhere we look, right? So we saw a beautiful episode of that in 2022, early 23, when supply chains were really under big crunch, post-COVID expansion, right? And continued clean energy transition, right? Put enormous strain on all of these clean energy material supply chains, lithium, copper, what have you, nickel, et cetera, right? And we saw price spikes in all of these commodities to different extents. The lithium is the most beautiful example, a key ingredient of batteries, of course. And so what did we see then? We saw a moderation of prices afterwards. Was that moderation because of reduction in demand? No. Demand and, in fact, output kept increasing at an enormous clip. You see it down here for lithium production worldwide, right? The key is simply we're just developing that industry a lot more, right? We're yet to really run out of any kind of raw material that we really want. What's needed is for supply chains to keep track with demand, but the market generally solves that really well. Okay. All right. So. And of course, we're electrifying things that just a few years ago, we really never anticipated to be electrifying, among them trains, incredibly large mining trucks, and all of that. Runs on batteries recharged by solar and wind. Okay, now what's the outlook to 2050? We're looking at a radical change in the energy supply mix globally. A radical change, okay? And let's dwell on this just a little moment. We're showing 3 different scenarios here from the IEA World Energy Outlook here. The top one, right, where you see the least amount of decline in fossil fuel production and use, is the current policy scenario, if you will, right? Current policies currently in place, right? Not counting anything that's kind of pledged but not translated into policy. What do we see here? Well, we see coal and gas no longer increasing, but kind of ambling along all the way out to 2050. And we see coal declining. Even under current policy settings, coal declining. When we move to announced pledges, that's the middle one, right? So announced pledges, what do we imagine that? That's translating all of the world's net zero pledges into emissions trajectories by countries. Imagine something like that, right? What do we see then? Well, we see dramatic reductions in output and use of all the fossil fuels, right? And then if we go one step further, if the world was on something resembling a net zero, a 1.5 degree type track, then we'd see much faster withdrawal of fossil fuels still, okay? So somewhere in among between the blue and the green is where we will likely end up, okay? And of course, a commensurate increase in renewable energy, as well as some increase in nuclear energy anticipated to backfill for that. What does that mean for fossil fuel producers? Well, it means the falling away of an enormous source of export revenues and of economic activity, right? And if you want to understand the magnitude of some of that, I recommend to you the production gap report that was released a few weeks ago by Stockholm Environment Institute, UNEP, and a few other organizations. Tallies up individual countries' fossil fuel production and exports and plans and projections for the future as well. And a notable thing is that the economic vulnerability to that phase down or phase out of fossil fuels is really concentrated in a small number of countries, and Australia is one of those countries. And so if you're ever wondering why the politics of climate change has been so difficult in the past, if maybe you will be wondering in future why the politics of climate change isn't becoming completely easy, that's really a big part of the answer, right? We're number 5 on that list globally, right? Behind China, US, Saudi Arabia. And what's the 4th one? Russia, of course. How could I forget? Yeah, So that won't be easy. So one thing to watch for at COP28 is fossil fuel phase down versus fossil fuel phase out. And the debates around that, unilateral positions around that, and whatever ultimately a COP decision might be on that. And they're just words, right? But ultimately they're words that are being taken seriously in the boardrooms and among the investment banks and super funds of this world, right? And so financial decisions will in the end be influenced, in some cases strongly influenced, by the signals that the governments of the world will be sending by what they agree or do not agree at forums like the UNFCCC. Okay. Now, another little nugget here from the production gap report, right? The question here being, to what extent do fossil fuel producing countries' own projections/plans reflect the likely future phase down of fossil fuels? The answer is not so much. Okay, so if you tally, so what this clever little sort of compilation of statistics shows here is at the top, right? The aggregation of what the major fossil fuel producing countries' own projections for their own output of fossil fuels add up to. And then down here, you've got the stated policy scenario, right? Well below what fossil fuel producers are saying they expect to happen, right? And then further below, of course, the reduction scenarios that are consistent with 2 degrees, right? So there's the world of difference. And so a question then is, of course, why is that, right? Is that we're kind of telling ourselves a beautiful little story about the coming decline in fossil fuel output that'll help us deal with climate change, and fossil fuel producing countries know better? Or is it that fossil fuel producing countries and the governments of fossil fuel producing countries can't quite get to grips with the coming reality of reduced fossil fuel use and thereby reduced fossil fuel production and exports, and keep perpetuating a story of, yes, we'll act on climate change, but everything is fine in this economy over here, right? I think it's largely the latter, but maybe that's for discussion, and that's of course simply my guess. That's not based on any kind of evidence. Okay, I'll go through a whole broad range of things. A quick nod here to one of the really big things that will be coming, and that's industrial decarbonization. We used to think of the global heavy industry system as pretty much the last thing, if ever, that sees fundamental shifts to get to low or even approaching zero emissions, because it's just too hard to abate, kind of thing, right? We now understand that there are technological opportunities and that those technologies are likely to come into reach economically, right? And that goes for a whole lot of technology: steel, aluminium, cement, chemicals, what have you. It's a mix of shifting to green hydrogen produced using renewable energies, of direct electrification, for example, of heat-intensive processes, or of carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture use and or storage. So all of these things are coming into view as real opportunities. That's, of course, where Australia's kind of energy superpower opportunity sits predominantly ahead of everything, all other aspects. Okay. Now, investment, few words on investment, right? This massive change will require massive inflows of money into clean energy and into systems that use clean energy, in particular electrification, right through the economy. Recent trends have clean energy investment rising really quickly, right? But also have fossil fuel related investment still increasing at a much more gradual rate, right? And so clean energy investment have already been larger than fossil fuel investments for a number of years and are now much larger, okay? But we can anticipate that fossil fuel related investments will in fact start declining. What are the magnitudes here? Well, really large. So globally, we'll be looking in these sort of 1.5 to 2 degree compatible scenarios, we'll be looking at an increase of global annual energy investment from around about a bit under 3 trillion US per year, right? So that's what, like twice the Australian economy or something, roughly speaking, to something like 4 to 5 trillion a year, right? And that maintained over 3 decades or so, right? So this is a massive, massive push into building the next energy and industrial and transport and housing system, right? That'll last a very long time indeed, and that'll be run on very low operating costs, right? But that will have to be built on relatively high upfront costs, right? So, your solar panel on your roof, right? Upfront cost, and then pays back reasonably quickly over time, but has high upfront costs. That's just mirrored throughout the world economy everywhere, right? And so that raises some questions as to how that will actually happen, right? Because that ramp up will need to be concentrated in developing and industrializing countries, right? Interestingly, it's actually not so much China where the ramp up will need to happen, because China already invests extremely large amounts of money into both clean and fossil fuel systems, right? But it's developing countries where real ramp up needs to happen, and also rich countries, right? Because we're replacing old capital stock, right? And so when you get to that kind of magnitude of extra investment, the question becomes, where will all of that money come from, right? When you're talking 1-2% of GDP, that's just not kind of lying around to be found behind the sofa to be deployed to clean energy transition. That will need to come from somewhere. That means fewer hospitals. That means less military expenditure. I don't see that. That means less consumption expenditure probably in the end, right? Which is a big societal conversation to be had, right? How can we get to a point where we can accept that we'll be doing fewer home renovations to pay for the renovation of the national energy and industrial system, right? It's going to come to those kinds of topics. And that, of course, takes us to some of the big sort of influencing factors on energy policy and climate policy. So firstly, I think undeniably there's a global trend towards looking inward, right? A sort of an isolationist trend that's reflected in many countries' politics, right? And so by and large, you'd say that diverts from climate change policy, right? Because what do you care about the global good when your focus is national, right? On energy and the low carbon energy transition, it can in fact go either way, right? Because it can also mean a shifting away, a deliberate shift away from imports, which in many cases means replacing fossil fuel imports with indigenous energy, which typically tends to be renewable energy, right? So there's a flip side there on the clean energy transition. There's also clearly the anticipation of possible conflict, and so these geostrategic big shifts, right? By and large, a negative for climate change, right? Because it diverts resourcing into, for example, military preparedness and so forth. But in some cases, once again, can be an upside for decarbonization in terms of, for example, the increased attention on domestic supply chains, right? And the expansion in particular of green supply chains. We currently see that in terms of, onshoring and friendshoring supply chains for battery metals and critical minerals, rare earths, and so forth. Finally, cost of living, right? And so we've seen post-COVID a fairly dramatic increase in cost of living in most countries. If we think we're feeling the pain, think of people at much, much lower income levels in our country and in other countries, right? We don't have it so bad, other people do. This is converted at the ballot box, okay? And we're seeing in Europe, for example, voting shares for extreme right-wing parties of 20% plus, okay? And so that's a factor there. Once again, that detracts from climate policy in terms of just the pure politics of it and because of scarcer fiscal resources. But on occasion can be an upside because of stronger focus on energy prices. And at this point where we are at with regard to energy technologies, investment in renewable energy will tend to bring energy prices down rather than increase them, right? And so where we have government push into renewables, that will, everything else being equal, yield lower consumer prices. And that's exactly what we're actually expecting in Australia's case as well. Okay. Energy and climate policy, some trends, well, more policy effort, emissions trading and taxes, in fact, on the rise. We're seeing here some carbon prices in some jurisdictions, a great number of jurisdictions, in fact, and the scale here, which you can't see, goes to $130, right? So it's really quite significant price levels in many countries, but also, of course, many other kinds of policies, increasingly regulatory policies, subsidy policies as well. And of course, of the subsidy policies, the US Inflation Reduction Act is the mother of them all. It's incredibly large and has that giant sucking sound, as they say in the industry. That seems to be a term of clean energy investment to the United States. And that has a lot of others scratching as to what should be the appropriate response, if any, to that. And we're seeing a sort of a great power competition really for technology leadership and market leadership in green industries, which, once again, when you step back from it and take, put yourselves in your shoes 15 years ago and imagine hearing that sentence. We have a great power competition over leadership in clean energy industries. How wonderful is that, right? Okay. Australian emissions projections, I won't dwell on this because the new projections are apparently due to be out very soon. This week, I hear, or something, so no point looking at last year's. The projections will say, this was in the papers the other day, that it'll be a 43% reduction by 2030 compared to 2005 with the existing policies. It's a 1% short. No, 42, 1% short of the 43%. How do you know? Well, you don't know, right? But the point here is, right, a lot of progress was made between 2005 to 2012, 14 in terms of reduced land clearing, and increased forest thickening gave us almost half of our target, right? Just like that. And since about 2017, we've really made progress in reducing electricity sector emissions, and that's continued to go. And there's certainly a hope that it will accelerate. Just on electricity, this is so amazing, it deserves a couple of minutes, right? So this is Australia's power mix on an annual basis from 1990 or something like that, right? And you see coal declining here, and the green and yellow is wind and solar, right? And that's beginning to really open up that wedge there, replacing coal with renewables. This is the last week on the national electricity market grid, right? And so we've got about 40% renewables there over the average of the grid last week, right? And during the middle of the day, right, the coal plants need to ramp down in order to make room for all of that solar, basically. This destroys the economics of the coal plants, right? Because it just eats valuable hours of output and puts extra strain on the equipment. Most of these plants were not built for ramping up and down, but many of them are being run into the ground by ramping them up and down because the operators know that they will not be economically keeping these plants. And the challenge really is to backfill as much as renewables as we can quickly. Glimpse of the future, South Australia, as always, oftentimes runs on 100% or close to 100% renewables now, with gas in there for a bit of balance, and imports and exports with Victoria mainly as a bit of a balancing factor as well. Okay, the next, of course, big topic on Australia's policy agenda is 2035 target. I've been joking with Climate Change Authority colleagues just before there will have to be some advice, I think, I don't know, by the end of the year or something on what the target might be. This is a tremendously, no, next year, right? Next year will be a tremendously important year for all of these kinds of policy assessment and recommendation exercises. Electricity policy, quick word on that. So we've had a big announcement there last week of the great expansion of the capacity investment scheme, which is a federal government scheme to underwrite minimum revenue for storage, and in the future also wind and solar power. Okay, now so this will be competitive. There will be 6 monthly tenders calling for bids, right, to supply wind and solar plants and storage plants, and require a minimum price level achieved in markets. If market prices are below that, then government jumps in and pays the difference. Okay, so there's schemes like that in operation already. Shares elements with contracts for difference that were sort of in Australia pioneered in the ACT and then taken up in Victoria, and a somewhat more, I'll say, sophisticated scheme in New South Wales that's in operation there. It's quite similar to that. Now, if you read the papers, opinions, or well, a lot of people relevant in this space are in this room now. Opinions are diverge over the merits of that. The main alternative would have been to reinvigorate the renewable energy target, right? I know where I am on that kind of dichotomy. I think the underwriting approach at this point in time in the situation we're facing is the right one. And in large part, I think so, because it will tend to keep electricity prices down. By keeping electricity prices down, we are not incentivizing end-use energy efficiency. That's a downside, right? But we're incentivizing fuel switching into electricity. We're incentivizing electrification, and that's really ultimately what matters. And, right, we'll tend to avoid political economy problems of the energy transition through rising energy prices in that by backloading some of the burden onto the budget of future years, right? That's my view on that. Facilitating the transition, really important. A fast rising concern and difficulty is local objections, in particular to transmission build out, right? So social license issues, and I think Beck, I won't go into that. Beck will have a few things to say about that. Just to flag that the Net Zero Economy Agency that is planned to morph into the Net Zero Authority is, of course, squarely in that field, and it's really interesting to watch the process of working out just what the remit will be of that authority and what its tasks may in the end, in fact, be. Okay, I won't dwell on Australia's opportunities and all this. We're all well aware: green hydrogen, green ammonia, green fuels generally as an exportable good, but also the opportunity, of course, for the production of energy-intensive commodities, right? More processing in Australia using cheap and abundant renewable energy here. Tremendous progress, prospects, I should say, and I would estimate in particular on green iron. One thing I would like to flag for the long term: imagine a world that's net zero, right? That's not a world that's zero emissions. That's a world that's low in greenhouse gas emissions that compensates the rest through carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. How do you remove carbon from the atmosphere? Well, vegetation. That won't be enough because there's competition, for food producing land, basically. And so, we will fall back on technological or, carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere through technological means. Could be direct air capture, captured straight from the air, could be enhanced weathering of silicate minerals, that kind of thing, right? Australia is well placed for any of these technologies, ridiculously well placed, in fact. What do you need? You need space and you need cheap, clean energy, right? Both tick, right? And you need reliable governance frameworks and open investment frameworks. And so when it comes to, the age of the carbon removalists, right, then Australia should be well placed for that. If other countries at that point in time actually prepared to invest in other countries to get the job done. Okay, coming to the end here, and just a few words on industry policy. So, what are the objectives of industry policy? It's often a bit confused, right? Why are we doing this? And the Treasurer's speech a couple of weeks ago, I thought was quite illuminating, because apparently Australia's objectives in this are all of the above, right? And so, we're going for competitiveness, for distribution of opportunity, which in this context is shorthand for regional transition, right? Bring the investment to areas that need it. Reliance, resilience, national security, all anchored to our climate and energy goals is the formulation. It's actually important to be clear about objectives. I don't know whether clarity has been fully achieved, but it's certainly kind of in the discussion. Some priority areas for industry policy have been identified, right? And it's notable that all of these priority areas relate to the energy and industrial transition to low carbon, right? It's actually quite remarkable, right? So we've got the outlines of a national industry policy that in its entirety relates to the to the low carbon transition. Okay. All right. I'll end on just some thoughts on industry policy. So first point is Australia is not America. And so, when we hear for calls for, $100 billion for an Australian IRA policy like that, what you want to consider is that the US is a large economy, largely with a domestic market, a strong manufacturing base that many think really needs reviving and can be revived, and has very strong strategic objectives in all of this in competition with China, right? As well as the European Union, right? Really none of these things apply to us, right? What we have is a strong comparative advantage based on geography and economic and governance systems, right? And we play into international markets, right? And so any subsidy given to clean energy export industries is ultimately partly a subsidy to producers here, but largely a subsidy to global consumers, right? And that's a great thing to be doing that for the world, right? But it's not clear that that is sustainable if there isn't also a clear domestic benefit to these policies, right? And that's the second point to the argument that I'd like to make just really at the end of my talk here. And that is that industry policy needs to be geared to ensure benefits for Australia, okay? And that's, that's as much as anything a call for kind of political sustainability of the whole thing, right? We need to focus on enabling that underlying comparative advantage and productivity, right? We should refrain from trying to push into things that we won't be any good at, right? Forget about that idea of producing solar panels in Australia, right? We can do that, of course. We'll be doing it at 3 times the cost as China does it. Okay, value for money for public expenditure, right? Where there are subsidies, they need to be competitive. They need to be turned over 3-4 times to check whether it's a good idea to spend money on these things. Environmental impacts at the local level, and very importantly, interactions with indigenous rights, practices, and cultural values, right? Many of these large-scale energy projects that we dream of and that are likely to happen will have negative impacts on indigenous communities, right? And that needs to be seen in context, and that needs to have measures to compensate for that and overcompensate for that, so that in the end, in net terms, the situation is better than without. And the final point, of course, is tax regimes, right? There needs to be money coming back, not just to shareholders, but also to the community as large. And that is in, I think, marked contrast to some of the previous industrial expansions that we've seen. Yeah, and so at this point, over to Beck and for the discussion. Thanks very much.
I've got 2 lines of question, but I'll stick to what we discussed about the Net Zero Authority and more broadly the role you see emerging for the federal government in the social aspects of the transition. I've been involved in a couple of studies in recent years that one's a career history study of people in the renewable energy and the fossil fuel sector, comparing their career experiences and work conditions and social commitments. And the other was a rural social study of the first renewable energy zones gazetted in New South Wales. With regard to the labour questions, I can really see how deeply felt the loss is. I've been working in the Lithgow Valley, generational mining community. What Wallerawang's closure has meant is extreme in some cases, but I see a lot of resilience as well. So I'm interested in your thoughts on the role of the federal government in supporting those communities. The other observation I would make is that the renewable energy workforce is very fragmented. We know their workplaces are now going to be dotted across the landscape. A lot of subcontracting, a lot of small businesses when we think about the rooftop solar installation. I'm wondering if the federal government sees a role for supporting that end of the workforce transition, or if that's something that's a bit in the too hard basket. In terms of rural change, the other thing I learned from a study with the Australia Institute and the Sydney Environment Institute was that it's a land-based economy. Actually, the bulk of the large wind and solar farms are going on private agricultural land, and there's a lot to do between the state planning regimes and the local governments, as well as residents and landholders that have long neighbourhood histories that get stirred up with developments like this. It's unsurprising. So given all these sort of unsurprising uneven developments around land and labour, plus the Indigenous questions that you raised at the end, can you say a bit more about how the federal government can prioritise its contributions to, you know, what is already a lot of policy work going on at the local government and state level?
I'm not sure that I can say too much about what the federal government might plan or do in that regard. It has a button. Yeah, not so sure what really can be said from the outside looking in. I think what we can observe is that the federal government now has the instruments to be a really active player in that field, right? With the net zero authority, right? But there'll need to be a process to define the remit of that authority, right? And there's an initial very short announcement that sets out a whole number of things that would, that could be interpreted as including all of this, right? The international experience is by and large that it's just a hodgepodge of different roles for national and subnational governments and local entities and civil society and all the rest of it. And it's kind of not done neatly anywhere, but in many cases, a lot is being done. And Beck, I'd like to turn it around, actually. Why don't you tell us what you think can happen and should happen?
I don't know for the federal government. I really think that there are some big collective action problems for the investors and the renewable energy firms themselves, and that's a key lever that I think you're right is an important priority for federal government. In terms of the planning regimes, it's from my initial research with colleagues, there's some very uneven developments around benefit sharing and genuine partnerships with Indigenous groups, as well as local communities. There's no shortage of good ideas out there. I don't know if it's the federal government that does that pooling of policy learnings, but certainly with the Australia Institute, our conclusion was that there's a lot of scope to be more formal about benefit sharing that goes beyond a voluntary planning agreement with a renewable energy firm painting the tennis court for the 10th time. There's a lot of, if you like, frustration in rural Australia about limited benefit sharing beyond the private flow of rent to landholders. So I think maybe one way to put it would be that the net zero authority should be empowering local government to do generate a new social compact with the state governments who really hold the planning levers on these things, even with the infrastructure investment acts we've seen online in Queensland.
Is money needed?
Pardon? Yeah, I think you ended with a kind of taxation, fair sort of tax outcome. And I actually had a question for you there, because where is the tax system in making sure that we socialise the benefits of this transition beyond the private realms, beyond the rooftops of our households and beyond the agricultural landholder situations that really dominate where the benefits are flowing? Can we use the tax and transfer system to really socialise the benefits more broadly? I'm sort of playing ping pong with you with questions now, but
one would think yes, right?
Yeah. And that's the parallel debate with the minerals rents tax and regional policies around benefit sharing with the mining communities. I have another question about fossil fuel production gaps, but I'm going to leave it in the name of getting questions from the floor. Renee, would you mind taking a question from the room, and I'll see what's going on our tablet?
Thank you for your talk. I'm interested, Frank, over here. Yep. Is when do you see carbon credits phasing out?
Oh, your question is about Australian carbon credit units?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, look, the way the system is built, the carbon credits are there certainly for the medium term, maybe for the long term. That's how the architecture is designed, right? And so to briefly recap, right? So the system was established for project-based emissions reductions in the land sector predominantly, which was funded by the federal government through tender purchases, and which is with the introduction or with the reforms to the safeguard mechanism is effectively being turned into a system where industry will buy the bulk of these, largely land-based credits is, more or less the expectation on this. And so barring any, very kind of fairly big picture policy reform on that, that's the system that we have for the time being. I think the job really is in making sure that there's environmental integrity to these presumed reductions, and that that integrity doesn't only exist, but that integrity is also recognized by the community more broadly. So I think that's ultimately, I mean, you can extrapolate to completely different systems where the land sector achieves more deeper and more broadly based emissions reductions, right? Through, for example, regulatory means enhanced by subsidy mechanisms, right? And one would, I think this is actually a space to watch because the net zero plans that are currently under development, one is for the agriculture and land sector. I think it's a genuinely open and interesting question to see what sort of suggestions come to the fore in that regard in terms of augmentation of the crediting mechanism.
I might go to our most popular question online from Jenny. She's asked, can we offset the loss to the economy from ending fossil fuel exports by becoming a renewable energy superpower?
We could, and hopefully we will. So the potential of Australia's export-oriented renewable energy exports far exceeds the current fossil fuel revenues, and that's actually work that was in good part pioneered at ANU under the Zero Carbon Energy for Asia Pacific initiative that Ken Baldwin here initiated together with a number of colleagues who are also in the room. And so some of that work, if all of the commodity, the raw material produced in Australia were actually processed in Australia before export, right, then the energy input inherent in that would be, many, many times the fossil fuel energy produced in Australia, and thereby, in rough terms, the value added would go likewise. So certainly the promise of that exists, right? To what extent it'll come to pass, we shall see.
There's actually another question here about fossil fuel phase out from Stefan. So Stefan says, given that 2020 has seen the highest demand for oil in history, and will probably also be this year the highest CO2 emissions ever, how credible are the outlooks for fossil fuel phase out? I get a sense from this presentation that we're, particularly in Australia, we're going to take the market signals. We're not really going to regulate for fossil fuel phase out, are we? We're going to...
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say no jurisdiction in the world that is fossil fuel producing and exporting is regulating for an active phase out. Norway probably comes closest,
Okay.
right? in terms of preparing for future reductions in oil and gas. But you know, I'm not sure that even there's an active policy to rein it in. It's much more, you know, it's much easier to sit back and say, let's see how it will pan out. There's a really valuable, I think, vein of largely academic and think tank research. It's called supply side climate policy research, that ultimately states something like, you know, if fossil fuel producers were able to coordinate their actions, right, and constrain fossil fuel supply collectively, right, then they could economically benefit from that while also helping the world get away from fossil fuels, right? It's been done in the past. It's called OPEC, right? And so, but we haven't got similar for gas nor for coal, right? And so if you think of an OCEC for coal or something like that, then, you know, theoretically at least, right, you could reap those terms of trade benefits for elevated prices for cartelization for fossil fuel producers, while at the same time constraining supplies. But, you know, that's a really quite a theoretical debate, because, you know, there's no mood or move in that direction detectable.
No. So really we've got demand side policies like the safeguard mechanism and maybe some limitations through the climate trigger that may emerge in the EPBC Act?
Yeah, look, I mean, a safeguard mechanism makes production of gas and oil, or processing of gas as well, a little more expensive, in particular for some production sites that are quite emissions intensive, right? But you know, that's on the emissions that occur in the production of those fossil fuels. That's not any impost on the carbon emissions inherent in those fossil fuels that will be exported.
Yeah. I think, did I see a hand up in this direction? Could we take 2 questions? Your choice, Jen. Is that all right? We'll finish after that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. Got a lot of interesting things out from your presentation. I would have one question about one point you made, and don't want to be too heretical, but you mentioned that sort of some of the money that we need in terms of the investments that we require is sort of not exactly lying around.
Yeah, we can hear.
Right. Okay, thanks. And I was wondering if I could sort of ask two points maybe. The first one, when we say the money is not lying around, what about the Cayman Islands? And I'm not saying that the solution is that simple and straightforward, but I think the French economist Thomas Piketty makes such an argument, and Piketty might, of course, be wrong, and he might have the wrong numbers, but what would be sort of the right number then if Piketty's figures are wrong? And sort of a second question, if we look at the IRA, some people have argued that the way it works is mostly to mobilize private investment. So for every dollar that the US government spends, investors are spending $10, which means that I think the $380 billion or something around that ended up getting into the act. I think come then towards sort of $2 trillion or so in terms of the private investment. Thank you.
Yeah, I saw Howard Bamsey nodding when the Cayman Islands was being mentioned. I don't know, but look, okay. So the financial side of things, of course, you know, we're touching here on distributive issues as well, right? And so I'm not sure who has money in the Cayman Islands. I don't, but I think it's more the, you know, the different levels of income and wealth where you have that. And of course, you know, when you're thinking of how anything like that can be financed, right? Then You know, if you could soak the rich, you could get there, basically, right? But that also is generally a political problem, right? You know, the concerns that I talked about, not the concerns, the questions that I'm raising with regard to how we're going to get this done with channeling so much resource into this transition, while at the same time there's a tendency to put more money into military and security and so forth, right, is one that's actually not financial. It's one of physical resources, right? And so at the moment, for example, there is competition for cranes, for engineers, for cement trucks, right? What are we going to do? We're going to build, are we going to build houses, right? Or roads, or transmission infrastructure and wind turbines, right? There comes a point where we need to choose, right? And that's really what I'm talking about, the physical resources and the need to put more physical resource, right? More labor, more stuff into things that will actually build up the system rather than into my next bathroom renovation, right? That's really the key point with regard to that. In terms of public-private, the bulk of this money will need to come from the private sector, very clear, right? And government's roles are best in facilitating private investments, right? And that's a question of bang for buck, right? And so if you compare US and sort of emerging Australian approaches, I think what we're about to do here is heaps better. So in the US, you've got a sort of basically, roughly speaking, a flat production credit, right? If you produce this thing, you're going to get a tax credit of X dollars, right? Roughly speaking, what we're embarking on here is a competitive system of bids. Who can produce the thing with the lowest required subsidy? You get the bid, right? So that's going to get you a bigger leverage range, really.
I might summarize my impression of the remaining questions here and just ask for you to give a short final comment. There's a couple of comments here about the extent of global warming already and the likelihood of 4 degrees. Lots of questions about policy mechanisms and potential priorities, like the capacity mechanism, co-location between agriculture and renewables and so on. And a question about hope. Now, I've always found you a very pragmatic, hopeful person, Frank. I'm wondering if you want to give us just a sort of summary of the key things that you think are the really positive developments to keep our eyes on over the next year.
Oh, it's purposeful optimism, Beck, isn't it? It's what keeps us going. Now, in terms of 4 degrees, I do not think that there's credible scenarios or likely scenarios that have us at 4 degrees at any time, unless we get it completely wrong in terms of the anticipation of climatic feedback mechanisms. And for that, I think you want to be attending the iceds climate update early in the next year.
You can pin Mark down at coffee.
Yeah, that's right. Overall, look, I think really, like I dwelt quite a lot on this sort of technology thing in the talk, right? And if you go back, 2006, right? Nick Stern in the UK does the first economic review of climate change, right? He had a good hard look at this thing back in 2006, right? When, this is a lot, like almost 20 years ago, we would have had time to turn this ship around, right? And what did he conclude? He looked at 2 degrees and 3 degrees global warming trajectories and costs and benefits, et cetera, right? I came to the conclusion that all but dismissed the 2 degree scenario as completely out the window, infeasible, forget about it. Let's focus on 3 degrees. This was 2006, right? So we've had a decade and a half of not that much, not enough policy effort, really. And nevertheless, we're in a situation where 2 degrees is in reach, right? So that's fantastic. That's tremendous. We're in a better situation now than we thought realistically we would be at this point in time, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? And the answer is that tech has turned out much better, right? And that actually the flexibility and malleability of economic systems is heaps better than we tend to anticipate and model as well. We got through the pandemic, right? Without, this was hard, right? For many people, but the economy as such didn't really take a major blow. In fact, we've learned how to work from home, right? And so, there's enormous extent of flexibility and adaptability in economic systems. And I think that's something to be genuinely optimistic about.
Great. What an excellent note to end on. I'm sorry to all of you who had no doubt excellent questions that we didn't have time for. Please join me in a final round of applause for Frank.